Hotep World. This is your brother Matthew Daniels, aka Ampu, aka the Chosen Few, aka the real bookworm. I'm not a bookworm, I'm the real bookworm. Make sure you get it right. And as always, world, may your name live on forever, and may your memory never die. Hotep, cheers to that. I want to thank you guys for tuning back in to part 2 of my segment on Atlantis. And what I'm going to do for anyone, if this is the first video that you're finding about Atlantis, just scroll through my page and you'll see part 1. And what I want you to do is go back and watch part 1 first, because in this video I'm going to finish reading the story that I began in the first video. And what I'm doing is I'm reading the original Atlantis story as documented in the works of Plato, his work called Critias. So go back, watch that video, get caught up with where we're at, and without any further ado, I'm going to go back to the work, the complete works of Plato, and I'm going to pick up where I left off. So make sure you go watch that other video so you will be familiar with what I've already said and what has already taken place in the story. So these things will make sense, because I don't want to take the time to go back and repeat myself. Okay, so let's get started. First, they constructed bridges joining the rings of sea, which surrounded the ancient metropolis, making a road out from the palace and into the palace. Their first project was to build a palace in the dwelling of the god and of their ancestors. One king inherited the project from his predecessor, and as he improved on the beauty of what had already been improved, he would surpass to the extent of his resources what his predecessor had been able to achieve. So what they're describing is Atlantis wasn't built overnight, basically. And so Atlantis achieved its grandiose status because each king would build and add to the civilization, and add to the structures, and add to the wealth of the nation of Atlantis. And when he passed the kingship on to his eldest son, and his eldest son became king, based on his know-how and the resources that he had at his disposal, he would preserve what the previous king did, and he would build more, he would add more, he would add more wealth, he would add more structures, and he would raise the status of living of the Atlantean people to a higher status. So they rose higher and higher and became greater and greater, because each king preserved what the previous king did, and they added to the achievements. They continued this progress until they had created for themselves a dwelling astonishing in its size and in its manifold beauty. And starting at the sea, they excavated a canal 3 plethora in width, 100 feet in depth, and 50 stades in length, up to the outermost sea ring. They then made a passage from the sea in the interior possible by opening a channel into the sea ring that was wide enough for the larger ships to sail into it as if it were a harbor. And as for the land rings that separated the rings of sea, they pierced them at the point of the bridges, and thus joined them by water. So if you went back and you watched the first video, you would already understand the description of how Atlantis was laid out. So what they're saying now is they dug canals in between the rings of land, the ringed islands separated by water, right? And they created bridges so that you could go from one section of the land to the other. But they dug out that canal big enough for the largest ships to pass through, so that an individual on a ship could come from the Atlantic Ocean and could go through these canals under the bridges and could go all the way into the center island. And he also says that not only did they build new structures, they also built and added on to previous structures, so that by the end of it, they had one structure that was so big, so immense, so magnificent, because kings added on to the building structure itself. The resultant canal was wide enough for a single trireme to sail through as it passed into a ring of water. They constructed a roof over the channel to protect the passage of ships, for the walls of the canal through the land rings were high enough from the sea to the bridge above to allow ships to pass under. The largest of the water rings, into which the passage from the sea had been excavated, was 3 stades in width, and the next land ring was equal to it. Of the next rings of water in land, the ring of water was 2 stades wide, and, as in the first case, the land ring was equal to it as well. And finally, the ring of water running around the island in the middle was a stade wide. The island where the palace was located had a diameter of 5 stades. They threw up an unbroken stone circuit wall around this island, and they also walled the land rings and the bridge, which was a plethron wide. They built towers and gates at the point where the bridges crossed over the rings of water. They quarried stone from under the circular island that formed the center ring and formed the inner and outer land rings as well. There were 3 colors of stone: white, black, and red. As they quarried this stone, they fashioned ship sheds for 2 ships in the rock, roofed by the stone of the quarry. So he's saying what they did next was they quarried stone, which was red, black, and white. Red, black, and white colored stones. And on the center island, in the center of Atlantis, they built a high wall around it with towers on it, you know. And so on each of the land rings that surrounded the center island, right, they built walls around this as well. So you get the image of a highly advanced, right, highly prosperous, right, and militarily defensible continent, right, or a set of islands, right. They had walls, high walls around each one of the land rings and around the center island where the actual palace was located, and they had towers and everything. So it was not the type of place that one could besiege or invade easily. It was damn near impossible. Okay, he says, some of their buildings they constructed of stones of uniform color, but to delight themselves they made of others a tapestry of stones of different colors, variegating the colors to bring out their natural charm. And they invested the entire circuit wall of the outermost land ring with bronze, as if the bronze revetment were a bright dot. The interior of the land wall they invested with tin, and the wall surrounding the Acropolis itself they invested with orichalcos, which glittered like darting fire. I will now describe the palace buildings erected within the Acropolis. So now we're going to get a look at an actual description of what the palaces looked like in Atlantis. At its center was the shrine of Plato and Poseidon. It was kept consecrated, and no one was permitted to enter it. It was surrounded by a wall of gold. It was here that Poseidon and Plato first begot and produced the race of the 10 kings. It was to this shrine that each of the 10 divisions came to offer their first fruits of each of these original kings in a yearly festival. So he's saying that there was a temple dedicated to Poseidon and Plato. Now, if you watch the first video, you're going to understand who they were. And he says that no one was allowed to enter this temple. And he says that the Atlanteans had a yearly festival where the 10 kings or the 10 governors over the 10 districts of Atlantis would come yearly and offer offerings at this particular temple. So this was the main temple structure in Atlantis, and they had a festival, a yearly festival where they came and made offerings, right? The temple of Poseidon was in this area. It was 1 stade long, 3 plethora wide, and of a height that appeared to be proportional to its length and width, but it had something barbaric about its appearance. They invested the entire exterior of the temple with silver, except for the exterior, which they gilded with gold. The interior presented a roof of solid ivory, inlaid with gold and silver and orichalcos. And they planted all the other areas of the temple with this same, and they plated all the other areas of the temple with this same metal, the cedar walls, the interior columns, and the floors. They placed gold statues within the temple. There was a statue of Poseidon standing in a chariot with a team of 6 winged horses. This statue was so tall that its head touched the rafter of the temple roof. There were 100 nereids riding dolphins and arranged in a circle about him, for men of that age thought that the nereids were 100 in number, and there were many other statues inside, which were the offerings of private individuals. Outside and surrounding the temple there stood gold statues of all the descendants of the 10 kings and their wives, and many other dedications of great size made by the kings and private individuals who came from the city of Atlantis itself and from the subject peoples elsewhere. There was an altar in the same scale as the temple, and its workmanship was equally lavish. The palace was magnificent in its monumental architecture, and it was worthy of the greatness of their empire and the adornment of the temple and shrines. They drew their water from 2 springs, a spring of cold water and a spring of hot water. Both had an abundant flow, and in the amazing natural freshness and quality of its waters, each had its own use. They built fountain houses around them and plantations of trees suitable to the temperature of the waters. And they also built reservoirs around the springs. Some they left open, but to the north they covered the reservoirs to convert them to warm baths. The reservoirs of the kings were separate from those of the rest of the population. Some reservoirs were reserved for the use of women, others for watering horses, and other draft animals, and each they fashioned appropriately to its use. The overflow they channeled into the grove of Poseidon, where, thanks to the fertility of the soil, there grew varieties of trees of extraordinary beauty and height. They also irrigated the outer land rings by means of canals that crossed over along the bridges joining them. Here there were constructed numerous shrines to numerous gods, and the land was laid out for many orchards and gymnasia. There were gymnasia for men on each of the 2 ring islands, and tracks for horses were set apart as well. And remarkably, through the middle of the greatest of the islands, they laid out a separate race course for horses, 1 stade wide, and it extended in a circle around the entire island. Located on each side of the central race course were quarters for the palace guards. So we see that throughout these palaces and throughout this area, they had a lot of statues. They had statues of the gods. They had statues of the kings and the descendants of the kings. Some of these statues were created by the Atlanteans, and some of these statues were created by individuals that were just subjects to the Atlantean Empire. They also held horse races. So apparently, one of the things that they did for entertainment in the Atlantean Empire, they hosted horse races. So they had several courses laid out for these particular races, but they had one, the main course was in the center island, right? Where they had one course laid out where they watched horse races, okay? The garrison of the most reliable soldiers was established on the smaller of the ring islands, the islands situated nearest the Acropolis, and quarters were built on the Acropolis for the most reliable soldiers of all, surrounding the palaces of the kings themselves. The ship sheds were filled with trimmies and all the fittings needed for trimmies, and all were in good working order. Such then were the buildings they constructed around the dwellings of the kings themselves. Now, once you had crossed over the 3 rings of water, you would come to a circuit wall that began at the sea and surrounded the greatest of the land rings on all sides at a uniform distance of 50 stades from the greatest land ring and its harbor. It began at the point where the channel had been dug through the sea. The entire area within was settled by a dense population whose houses were crowded close together. The waterway into the interior and the greatest harbor was teeming with ships and crowds of merchants who had arrived from all over the world and whose voices and bustle produced a commotion and hubbub that could be heard day and night. I have recalled this description of the capital and the ancient dwelling of the kings pretty much as it was told to Solon at that time. But now I must attempt to recall the nature of the rest of the country and the manner in which it was improved. To begin with, the priest said that the entire country was very high and that it rose sheer from the sea. The entire plain that surrounded the capital was itself surrounded by a ring of mountains that sloped down as far as the sea. The plain was smooth and level and entirely rectangular. On its long sides, it extended for 3,000 stades, and, as measured from the sea, it was over 2,000 stades across. The slope of the island was to the south, and it was protected from the northerly winds. The mountains surrounded the plain were legendary for their number and size and beauty. None of the mountain ranges that exist today can compare with them. They contained on their slopes and in their valleys many populous and wealthy villages, and they contained rivers and lakes and meadows that supplied enough to feed all the animals there, both domesticated and wild. In their abundance and variety, the shrubs and trees were plentiful with all kinds of constructions and uses. I will now relate how this plain had been developed by nature and by many kings and over a long period of time. For the most part, the plain was naturally rectangular, regular, and oblong, where it was not perfectly straight, and even then evened it out by excavating a great canal around it. As described, its depth and width and length provoked disbelief, since it was the work of human hands and so vast when compared to the other building projects. Nevertheless, I must repeat precisely what we heard then. The great canal was excavated to a depth of a plethron. It measured a stade wide along its entire length, and as it framed the entire plain, it came to a total length of 10,000 stades. As it received the flow of water that came off the mountains, and as this water circulated and reached the city on 2 sides, the trench allowed the water to flow out to the sea. Towards the interior, canals were cut in straight lines from the city over the plain, 100 feet broad at most, and these emptied their waters into the great canal facing the sea. These were spaced at an interval of 100 stades. They also cut horizontal connecting channels, linking one canal with another and with the city, and it is by these canals that they transported timber and the other products of the land on barges from the mountains to the city. They harvested their crops twice a year. In the winter season, they relied on the water of Zeus-sent rains, and in the summer season, they used the water stored in the earth, drawing it into their canal system to irrigate the crops. Now, as for the numbers of the men of the plain who were fit to serve in the army, each military district was assigned to contribute one commander. The area of each district was as much as 100 stades. The total of these districts came to 60,000. And as far as the population of the mountainous regions and the rest of the country goes, it is said to be too large to calculate. But counted by regions and villages, All men fit for military service were assigned to one of the 60,000 military districts, and they served under the commander of each district. In times of war, each commander was assigned to have in readiness a sixth part of the complement of a war chariot as a contribution to a force of 10,000 chariots, and in addition, 2 horses and 2 riders, a pair of horses without a chariot with its complement of 2 riders, a runner, a rider who could fight on foot, armed with a small shield, and serving as a charioteer or rider, who could mount either horse, 2 hoplites, 2 archers, and 2 slingmen, 3 light-armed soldiers with stones, and 3 with javelins. He also had to contribute 4 sailors to the crews manning 12,000 ships. There were the principles for raising an army. These were the principles for raising an army in the royal city. The formulas varied in the 9 other cities, and it would take a long time to describe them. The original ordering of powers and honors in Atlantis was as follows. Within his own patrimony and in his own city, each of the 10 kings held power over the inhabitants and over most of the laws, and he could punish or put to death whomever he wished. But as for their common empire and federation, the kings were regulated by the laws of Poseidon, as these had been passed down by tradition and according to an inscription which the first kings had cut on a stele of Orchomenus. This inscription was placed in the middle of the island in the sanctuary of Poseidon. Here, in every 5th or 6th year, in alternating sequence, it was their custom to gather. To both the even and the odd, they accorded an equal share. So what they're saying is, each of the 10 kings, right? They had 10 districts that was ruled over 10 individuals who were actual descendants from Poseidon himself. Right? Now, each one of these kings over each one of these districts had the ability to rule and issue out orders over their district. But their main law was a law that was derived from Poseidon himself. And they say that Poseidon himself had written his laws that he had given to the Atlantean people on a stele, right? And this stele was kept on the center island of Atlantis in the temple of Poseidon. So the holiest laws were derived from Poseidon himself, and they were written on a stele, right? And so each one of the 10 kings of one of the 10 districts were able to create laws and enforce and enact punishments for violation of these laws, but their laws were in direct correlation to the divine laws that came from Poseidon. And in every 5th or 6th year, all the 10 kings would convene at the center island and would consult these original laws that Poseidon had given them. Once they had assembled, they deliberated on matters of common concern and held on assize to determine if any one of them had broken the law, and they gave judgment. Whenever they were about to declare judgment, they first offered one another pledges in this manner. As all 10 kings were alone in the sanctuary of Poseidon, where bulls had been allowed to run free, they joined in prayer to ask the god to be allowed to capture the bull, which would be the most acceptable offering to him. They pursued the bulls with staffs and nooses, but with no iron weapon, and they led the bull they captured to the stele. So what he's saying is, every 5th or 6th year, the 10 kings would all come to that center island, right? And then they would deliberate amongst themselves about what was going on in the nation of Atlantis, right? They would talk about the laws, and they would even discuss if whether one of the 10 kings had violated a law. But before they could actually determine if one of the 10 kings had violated the law and what would be done about it, they had to perform an offering. Right? They had to perform an offering, and the sacrificial animal was a bull. So each one of them would release a particular bull, and they would offer a prayer to the gods and say that whichever bull was allowed to be caught, then that was the bull that was going to be made for the offering, because the gods allowed that bull to be caught to be sacrificed. So obviously it was the will of the gods for that particular bull to be sacrificed. Now I'm running out of time, but I hope I get into this because it's going to describe how this one of these actual sacrifices actually went. And let's get into it. Okay, there they slaughtered it. Well, remember, they led the bull to the actual stele with the laws of Poseidon on it, right? There they slaughtered it on the crest of the stele and let its blood spill over the inscription. In addition to the laws written on the stele, there was an oath inscribed calling terrible curses down upon those who broke them. And when they had then sacrificed the bull following this ritual, they would burn all the limbs of the bull, and mixing his blood in a mixing bowl, they would pour a clot of his blood over the head of each of them. And once they had scrubbed the stele clean, they would bring the remaining blood over to the fire. So they would capture this bull that was slated for sacrifice, right? And they would take it to the stele. Now, they give us some more insight into this stele. On this stele was not only the laws of the Atlantean people, but it was also inscribed curses that would befall the Atlantean people if they violated these divine laws. That's very interesting. So they would slaughter the bull. They would allow the blood of the bull to drip down over the stele, right? Then they would take some of this blood, mix it up in a mixing bowl, and they would put some of that bull onto each one of the 10 kings. Then they would clean the stele off, clean the blood off of the stele, and then they would bring the rest of the blood to the fire to offer some type of burnt offering, because they burnt after they sacrificed it and got the blood. They burnt the limbs of the bull in some type of burnt offering to the gods, right? And that's very interesting. Some of you know why that's interesting, but the rest of you just enjoy the conversation. After this, they would draw the blood from the mixing bowl into gold pouring vessels. Pouring the blood over the fire, they would take an oath to render justice according to the laws inscribed on the stele and to punish anyone who had violated these laws since they last met. They swore that in the future they would not willingly violate any of the provisions of the inscription, and that they would neither rule nor obey a ruler if either they or he did not issue commands that were in conformity with the laws of their father. When each of the kings had made this oath and engaged both himself and his descendants, they drank and dedicated their pouring vessels in the sanctuary of the god. And once they had finished with their dinner and everything else they had to do, and night had fallen, and the fire about the sacrificial offerings had subsided, they all put on a deep blue robe of the most splendid appearance, and, sitting on the ground next to the embers of the sacrificial victim at night, they put out the fire still flickering in the sanctuary, and judged anyone accused of violating any of their laws, and were judged themselves. Once they had passed judgment, when day dawned, they recorded their judgments on a gold tablet, which they dedicated as a memorial offering along with their robes. So one of the ways that they kept order is when they came together and they performed these offerings and these sacrifices, they also bound themselves to an oath, or rebound themselves to an oath, because they did it every 5 or 6 years. They would agree that they would not rule in a matter contrary to the original laws given by their fathers, Poseidon and his sons, right? And they would also agree that they would not obey a ruler who violated any of those laws, or who tried to get them to do something that was in contrary to those laws. And they agreed that they should be punished if they violated these divine laws. And this is how they kept morality inside of the kingdom of Atlantis. They always referred back to these original laws, and they referred back to the curses that will befall the people if they violated these original laws. And they agreed that they would follow these laws, and they would not follow a law that was contrary to those laws, right? There were many other particular laws concerning the prerogatives of each of the kings, but the most important of these were those forbidding them to bear arms against one another and commanding them to help another should anyone in any of their cities make an attempt to overturn the divine family, that they should deliberate together as had their ancestors before them over their decisions concerning war and their other actions, but that they should cede leadership to the royal family of Atlantis, and finally, that the king should have power to put none of his kinsmen to death if he could not obtain the approval of the majority of the 10 rulers. Now, we're almost finished with this thing about Atlantis, and I'll have to do one more video so that I can read the remainder of that and explain just a few more things about Atlantis. So the next video isn't going to be that long, but just to talk about what they just said, right? So they clearly said that kings have prerogative to make other laws and have other laws in their respective districts, but those laws couldn't violate the divine laws that were actually given to the people by Poseidon himself. And they all agreed to a pact that if individuals in one district were to try to overthrow the king in that district, all of them would band together to help that individual retain power, right? And that they would have no king who wasn't a divine king, who had direct bloodline going all the way back to Poseidon, and that the rulers will always be the divine family that actually came from Poseidon. So I'm going to wrap up this segment on the original story of Atlantis, but I hope the first video and this video brought more clarity to the original Atlantis story, and I'm hoping it's bringing more clarity to how the Atlanteans actually lived. Again, I'm not making a case that Atlantis is real or Atlantis is fake. That's not what these videos are about. What this video is about is expressing to you and reading to you the original Atlantis story, because there are a lot of books and there are a lot of movies concerning this topic, and there is a lot of things that weren't actually in the original story. So what I wanted to do is expose anyone interested to the actual story itself. Now, I'm going to make one more video where I'm going to read the rest of the account. I'm going to read what Plato wrote in Timaeus, and I'm just going to tie up any and all loose ends. But before I go, as always, quick commercial break. Let me pay a few bills. I'm an author, right? I wrote 2 books. If you like these videos, if you like what I'm doing, if you support what I'm doing, and you appreciate what I'm taking the time out to do, and if you're hearing information that you like and that you never heard before, you can always show your support by me by purchasing one of my novels. I'm an author. I wrote books, and the greatest thing for an author is to have his works written and dispersed among the populace, right? So you can go to Amazon.com, right? Amazon.com, type in Suicide Note by Matthew Daniels, right? You can type in Thicker Than Water by Matthew Daniels, right? And you can purchase one of these books, paperback form. If you do not like paperback books, okay, if you do not like paperback books, you can always order the ebook version. The ebook version is on Amazon as well for only $2.99. Or you can go to my Facebook page, Everything Matthew Daniels, and you can order my books there directly from me. So I really would appreciate it if you guys haven't read my books, if you haven't ordered one of my books, I really would appreciate it if you guys show a little support and either order the paperback version or the ebook version. It'll really make my day. Every time I see new sales, or every time I see someone tell me, hey, Bookworm, hey, Matthew Daniels, hey, Chosen Few, I ordered your book, it makes me smile. And every time someone reads it and says that they enjoyed it, that they enjoy reading it as much as I enjoy writing it, it makes me smile. So I would really like to get my works out there to the public. So if you don't mind, go and order one of my books. And if you don't like paperback, go ahead and go order the ebook version of my books. It'll really make my day. So thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Be on the lookout for the next part, and be on the lookout for the conclusion. This your brother, Matthew Daniels, a.k.a. Pooh, a.k.a. The Chosen Few, a.k.a. The Real Bookworm. I'm not a bookworm, world. I'm the real bookworm. Make sure you get it right. And as always, world, may your name live on forever, and may your memory never die. Hotel, cheers to that. Peace. I'm out.